May 1945. The war in Europe was effectively over. German armies were collapsing in fragments, surrendering by the tens of thousands. Allied flags were already being sewn for victory parades that had not yet begun. Inside the Allied command structure, however, one decision was being quietly enforced with absolute finality. George S. Patton was ordered to stop. The order did not come from Berlin or from any remaining German headquarters. It came from his own side. It was delivered through channels that left no room for interpretation. Patton's Third Army would not advance further east. His authority would not expand. His voice would no longer shape the final phase of the war. This decision was not made on a battlefield. It was made in offices where maps were already being redrawn for a postwar world. Patton was not accused of failure. He was not relieved for incompetence. His armies had performed exactly as expected. In some cases, better than expected. That was not the problem. The problem was that Patton was no longer useful in the role that now mattered most. At that moment, the Allied Supreme Command was no longer focused on defeating Germany. Germany was finished. The priority had shifted to preserving the alliance that had won the war, managing the transfer of territory, and preventing the victory from collapsing into a new conflict before the old one had formally ended. Patton did not belong in that environment. He had made that clear repeatedly. He had said so publicly. He had said so to his staff. He had said so in ways that could not be retracted, softened, or ignored. The decision was simple, even if the consequences were not. Patton would not be allowed to rise any higher. He would not become Supreme Commander. He would not be given a role that required silence, restraint, or political discipline. The war was ending. A different kind of command was beginning. Patton was deliberately left behind. At that moment, the military opportunity was unusually clear. By late April and early May 1945, the German army in the West no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. What remained were fragments, retreating columns, local commanders acting without coordination, units surrendering to whoever reached them first. The operational picture facing Allied ground forces was not one of resistance, but a vacuum. Patton's Third Army sat at the center of that vacuum. From a purely military standpoint, speed was the decisive factor. Terrain favored maneuver. German fuel stocks were gone. Communications were broken. Reserve formations did not exist. There was no operational depth left to absorb a breakthrough because there was nothing left to break through. The front was a fiction maintained on maps, not a reality on the ground. American armored formations had demonstrated, repeatedly, that they could advance faster than German forces could retreat. When fuel was available, Patton's units moved faster than Allied planners had anticipated and faster than German intelligence believed possible. This was not reckless motion. It was exploitation of collapse. The Wehrmacht's defensive doctrine required time, reserves, and coordination. None of those conditions were present. From a military logic perspective, the remaining objectives in Central Europe were no longer tactical. They were positional. Whoever occupied ground first would dictate terms later. Cities, river lines, transportation hubs, and political capitals mattered not because they would decide the war, but because they would decide the settlement. Berlin was the most obvious example, but it was not the only one. Czechoslovakia, Austria, and large portions of southern Germany were open. German commanders in these regions were actively seeking American forces, not to fight them, but to surrender to them. They understood what Soviet occupation would mean. Their behavior confirmed the intelligence picture. Resistance was ending everywhere the Americans approached. Patton understood this environment instinctively. His proposals reflected it. He was not asking for set-piece battles or costly assaults. He was asking to move, to occupy, to arrive first. His logic was consistent with classical operational warfare. Exploit momentum until it runs out, because momentum is the only resource that cannot be stockpiled. There were no credible military arguments that German forces could stop such an advance. There were only arguments about what would happen after. From a strictly military lens, delaying movement had only one effect. It allowed another force to occupy the same ground unopposed. Every mile not driven by American columns was a mile conceded without exchange. No casualties were saved by stopping. No German formations were destroyed by waiting. The battlefield no longer imposed costs. Only decisions did. This was the opportunity. A collapsing enemy, an open road network, unmatched mobility, and an opponent whose commanders had already accepted defeat. It was the rare moment when military logic offered simplicity rather than complexity. Advance. Occupy. End it. Nothing on the ground contradicted that conclusion. The constraints did not come from terrain, logistics, or enemy action. They came from elsewhere. That distinction mattered. Because once the opportunity passed, it could not be recreated. The war would still end. The armies would still stop. But the map would look different. And the consequences of that difference would last far longer than the fighting itself. Patton did not stumble into his position by accident, nor was his assessment improvised in the final weeks of the war. Long before Germany collapsed, he had prepared for exactly this moment. Patton's understanding of the campaign was not tactical in the narrow sense. He did not obsess over individual engagements. He focused on tempo, dislocation, and enemy psychology. His planning assumed that modern armies rarely collapse evenly. They fracture. They unravel in pockets. When that unraveling begins, speed becomes more decisive than firepower. This belief shaped how he trained, how he issued orders, and how he organized his headquarters. His staff was conditioned to move with minimal guidance. Commanders were encouraged to act on intent rather than instruction. Supply officers were told to keep formations moving even if it meant bending procedure. Patton accepted friction as inevitable and delay as unacceptable. By early 1945, this approach had already been validated. German defenses had not been defeated so much as bypassed, outpaced, and rendered irrelevant. Units that expected days to withdraw were cut off in hours. Command posts were overrun before orders could be issued. The enemy's internal communications lagged behind reality, and Patton exploited that lag relentlessly. His warnings to higher command followed the same logic. Patton argued that the collapse in the West was not symmetrical with the advance in the East. He understood that the Red Army was advancing with overwhelming force, but at immense cost. He also understood that once German resistance ended, the Soviets would not stop moving simply because agreements existed on paper. Occupation would define leverage, not signatures. This was not a spontaneous political opinion. It was a continuation of his operational thinking. Armies advance until they are stopped. If they are not stopped, they keep going. Patton applied that logic equally to allies and enemies. He saw no natural braking mechanism once German resistance disappeared. His internal assessments emphasized one point repeatedly. The only thing that could halt Soviet momentum was physical presence. Not declarations. Not conferences. Not promises. Armies already in motion did not reverse themselves voluntarily. Patton communicated this bluntly, without adjustment for audience. He did not tailor his language for civilian leadership. He did not soften conclusions to preserve harmony. He believed clarity was a form of duty. That belief extended upward as much as downward. In his planning memoranda and staff discussions, Patton treated the end of German resistance as a transition phase, not an endpoint. He prepared his officers for continued movement, continued occupation, continued uncertainty. He explicitly rejected the idea that victory would naturally produce stability. This mindset gave his warnings credibility inside his own command. His subordinates had seen his predictions validated too many times to dismiss them as temperament. When Patton said an opportunity would vanish if not seized immediately, his officers understood what that meant in practical terms. They had lived it. But the same qualities that made his assessment militarily coherent made it politically radioactive. Patton did not frame his warnings as suggestions. He framed them as inevitabilities. He did not acknowledge competing priorities because he did not believe they altered the underlying mechanics of power. To him, movement created facts, and facts constrained diplomacy, not the other way around. This perspective left little room for negotiation inside a coalition whose survival depended on negotiation. Patton was not wrong about the trajectory of events. He was early, and he was inflexible. His preparation was thorough. His logic was consistent. His foresight was grounded in experience, not ideology. But foresight alone did not determine authority. In a war that had become a political enterprise by necessity, Patton's clarity became a liability. His warnings were accurate enough to alarm, but uncontainable enough to threaten the very structure that had allowed the war to be won. That tension had been building for months. By May 1945, it no longer required debate. The decision to limit him followed naturally from the way he thought, planned, and spoke. Not because his assessment lacked merit, but because it could not be accommodated. The warning had been delivered. What followed would determine whether it would be heeded, silenced, or overridden entirely. The overrule did not arrive as a single order. It emerged through layers of restraint, hesitation, and institutional pressure that converged at the top of the Allied command. By the spring of 1945, the Supreme Allied Commander was no longer operating as a battlefield general. His function had shifted. He was now a custodian of coalition stability. Every decision was weighed not against German capability, but against Allied cohesion, Soviet expectations, and political commitments already made in rooms far removed from the front. The central constraint was not military feasibility. It was legitimacy. The Allied war effort rested on agreements that had already been signed and publicly affirmed. Boundaries of advance had been negotiated in advance, not because they reflected battlefield realities, but because they preserved unity among partners who did not trust one another. Those agreements could not be openly violated without consequences that extended beyond Germany's defeat. Berlin had been allocated. Zones of occupation had been defined. Lines on maps had become promises. Breaking those promises would not merely embarrass governments. It would signal that military momentum could override diplomatic consent. In a coalition built on consent, that was unacceptable. Patton's proposals cut directly across this logic. He treated agreements as provisional and power as decisive. That perspective was intolerable at the level where the war was now being managed. The leadership in Washington and London did not fear German resistance. They feared fracture. They feared that one American general, acting with operational autonomy, could undo years of alliance management in a matter of days. There was also the Soviet factor, which could not be separated from personality. Trust between allies was thin and transactional. The presence of American forces advancing into areas already promised to Soviet occupation risked immediate confrontation. Not later. Not theoretically. Immediately. No mechanisms existed to resolve such a clash once it occurred. There were no shared command structures, no arbitration processes, no agreed rules for disengagement between Allied armies once Germany collapsed. Any clash, even accidental, would have been interpreted as intent. The Supreme Commander understood this. His authority did not extend to managing a war between former allies. He had no mandate to test Soviet reactions or reinterpret agreements unilaterally. His orders flowed from political leadership that had already decided that avoiding a post-war rupture mattered more than symbolic or positional advantage. Patton, by contrast, had demonstrated that he would not self-censor. He had publicly expressed hostility toward the Soviet Union. He had made comparisons that alarmed civilian leadership. He had framed future conflict as inevitable and treated restraint as weakness. These statements were not private venting. They were reported, circulated, and scrutinized. In a system dependent on message discipline, this was intolerable. The overrule, therefore, took a specific form. Patton was not confronted directly. He was constrained procedurally. His operational freedom was reduced. His requests were delayed, rerouted, or denied without argument. He was given missions that absorbed his energy without expanding his influence. When movement halted, it halted everywhere, not because it had to, but because it must. This was not about punishment. It was about insulation. The Allied command structure could tolerate difficult personalities as long as they remained tactically contained. It could not tolerate unpredictability at the strategic level. Patton had crossed that boundary not through insubordination, but through incompatibility. His worldview no longer aligned with the function his rank implied. There was also the matter of optics. The Supreme Commander had spent the war absorbing blame. deflecting rivalry and neutralizing ego. He understood that the war's legitimacy depended on the perception of collective effort. Allowing Patton to dominate the final phase would undermine that narrative. It would elevate one national figure at the expense of the alliance itself. That risk extended domestically as well. Patton's popularity, volatility, and public statements created a political liability. Civilian leadership did not want him as a symbol of victory. They wanted closure, not controversy. Thus the system acted. Orders were framed as operational necessity. Justifications referenced logistics, boundaries, and coordination. None of them addressed the real issue. The real issue was that the war had moved into a phase where discipline mattered more than brilliance, and Patton had never believed in discipline at that level. The overrule was complete by the time it became visible. Patton remained in uniform. He retained rank. His achievements were not erased. But his trajectory ended quietly, without ceremony, without confrontation, and without appeal. The system had done what it was designed to do. It neutralized a force that no longer served its priorities. What followed on the ground would demonstrate the cost of that choice, not in terms of battles lost or won, but in terms of how the victory itself was shaped. The consequences unfolded quietly, but they were not subtle. Once Patton was halted, the momentum of the American advance did not merely slow. It ended. Columns that had moved for weeks without pause were ordered to stop where they stood. Engines were shut down. Bridges were secured and then deliberately not crossed. Units that could see open roads ahead were instructed to turn away from them. In some sectors, American patrols could hear Soviet artillery in the distance while standing still. The battlefield did not change. The decisions did. As American forces paused, Soviet formations continued moving. They encountered little resistance. German units that might have surrendered to the Americans now surrendered to the Red Army instead. Cities were entered without contest. Administrative control followed military presence automatically. What had been theoretical lines on planning maps became facts on the ground. Berlin fell to the Soviets alone. That outcome was not the result of superior maneuver or decisive engagement. It was the result of uncontested access. The Western Allies did not arrive second. They did not arrive at all. The same pattern repeated across Central and Eastern Europe. Areas that American forces could have occupied without a fight were left open. Once occupied by the Red Army, they did not change hands. There was no mechanism to reverse that process. No conference undid it. No protest altered it. For German civilians and soldiers, the difference was immediate and permanent. Those who surrendered to American units were processed, fed, and repatriated. Those who fell under Soviet control entered a different system entirely. The distinction was understood by everyone on the ground. It required no explanation. Inside Patton's former area of influence, frustration hardened into resignation. Officers who had spent the war rewarded for initiative were now punished for movement. The rules had changed without announcement. The habits that had produced victory were no longer valued. Compliance replaced exploitation. Patton himself was sidelined administratively. His command was reduced in relevance. He was reassigned to duties that emphasized record-keeping and historical documentation rather than operations. This was not accidental. It removed him from any position where his views might translate into action. Publicly, the transition was presented as routine. Privately, it was understood as final. Within months, the geopolitical consequences became visible. The zones of occupation hardened into borders. Temporary military arrangements solidified into political realities. Governments were installed under Soviet supervision. Security services were reorganized. Opposition was eliminated systematically. The wartime alliance dissolved into suspicion almost immediately. Patton observed this process from the margins. His earlier warnings were not acknowledged, but they were no longer necessary. Events validated them without commentary. There was no single moment where the cost of the decision could be tallied. No casualty figures captured it. No after-action report quantified it. The consequences were measured in decades rather than days. The American military emerged victorious but constrained. It had won the war it was assigned to fight, but not shaped the peace that followed. The Soviet Union emerged bloodied but strategically dominant across half a continent. That dominance did not come from a final battle. It came from being allowed to arrive first. Patton's removal from operational relevance ensured that no American commander would challenge that outcome in real time. By the time the implications were fully understood, they were irreversible. The war ended as planned. The settlement did not. That distinction defined the postwar world. The postwar record closed the case without ceremony. In memoirs, internal memoranda, and later declassified correspondence, the rationale behind Patton's marginalization was never framed as error. It was framed as necessity. Senior Allied leaders consistently described the final months of the war as a period where military excellence had become subordinate to political management. Patton appeared in these records not as a liability on the battlefield, but as a destabilizing variable at the negotiating table. The language was careful. He was described as brilliant, aggressive, effective. He was also described as uncontrollable, indiscreet, and unsuitable for coalition leadership. These descriptions were not contradictory. They were cumulative. Together, they explained why his advancement stopped where it did. Dwight Eisenhower's postwar writings were particularly revealing. He did not dispute Patton's military judgment regarding the Soviet Union. He did not claim that Patton misunderstood the emerging balance of power. Instead, Eisenhower emphasized a different priority: the obligation to end the war without fracturing the alliance that had made victory possible. In that framework, being right was insufficient. Being manageable mattered more. Other senior officers echoed this logic. They acknowledged, sometimes reluctantly, that Patton's predictions had aligned closely with subsequent events. They also noted that those predictions, if acted upon prematurely, would have shattered Allied unity in 1945. The record does not portray a man silenced because he was wrong. It portrays a man sidelined because acting on his views was deemed unacceptable at that moment. Patton's own postwar writings removed any remaining ambiguity. He did not retreat from his positions. He did not soften his assessments. He did not reframe his language to preserve reputations. If anything, he became more direct. He openly criticized occupation policies. He rejected the moral distinctions being drawn between defeated enemies and victorious allies. He described the emerging order in Europe with contempt rather than optimism. These writings confirmed what Allied leadership already believed. Patton had not been temporarily out of step. He was fundamentally incompatible with the structure that emerged after victory. There was no institutional effort to rehabilitate him, no quiet reconsideration, no delayed promotion. His death later that year froze the narrative, but it did not alter it. The decisions made about him were not revisited. They did not need to be. In later Cold War analyses, Patton appeared as a footnote to inevitability. Historians noted that the geopolitical division of Europe followed the lines established in 1945 almost exactly. They noted that warnings about Soviet expansion were accurate. They also noted that no Western leader was willing to risk immediate confrontation to alter that trajectory at the moment when it still might have been possible. The post-war record, therefore, delivered a consistent verdict. Patton was never meant to command the peace. He had been selected, empowered, and tolerated to win a specific kind of war. When the war transformed into something else, his usefulness ended. The system did not adapt to him. It replaced him. That outcome was not tragic. It was procedural. The documents show no panic, no regret, no second thoughts. Only acknowledgement that the choice had been made deliberately, with full awareness of what it sacrificed and what it preserved. The alliance survived. The settlement hardened. The world divided. Patton's absence from the final command structure did not prevent these outcomes. It ensured they occurred without internal disruption. That, according to the record, was the point. The record closes without ambiguity. George S. Patton was never denied supreme command because he lacked ability. He was denied because ability was no longer the decisive currency. By the time Germany collapsed, the war had ceased to be a contest of maneuver and firepower. It had become a contest of restraint. Patton did not believe in restraint. He believed in momentum. He believed that power and use decayed, and that hesitation created enemies faster than action did. That belief had carried him across France and deep into Germany. It also disqualified him from shaping what came next. The Allied system did not need another battlefield commander in 1945. It needed a custodian, someone who could absorb insults, suppress instincts, and enforce agreements he did not fully control. Someone who could treat silence as a weapon and patience as a strategy. Patton could do none of that. Not because he was incapable, because he refused. The decision to stop him was not a betrayal. It was an acknowledgement. The alliance chose stability over leverage. It chose predictability over advantage. It chose a managed peace over an uncertain extension of war. That choice produced a divided continent, a frozen settlement, and a confrontation deferred rather than resolved. Patton had warned this would happen. His warning was accurate. It was also unusable. History did not punish the decision. It recorded it. Patton remains remembered as a commander who won battles faster than his superiors could exploit them. Eisenhower remains remembered as the man who kept the alliance intact long enough to declare victory. Both assessments are correct. They are not compatible. Patton was built to win wars in motion. The final phase of the Second World War required winning a war that had already stopped moving. That is why he was never supreme commander. The case is closed. If this analysis added clarity, subscribe for more closed-case military histories, and leave a comment with the next decision you want examined.